what I learned at Yale was a more precise definition of shalom. Right? So we all know that shalom means peace. And that's accurate, but it's imprecise. Right? A more precise meaning would be right relationship. That the pursuit of shalom, the pursuit of peace, is the pursuit of right relationships. So one of the things I did at Yale was I pondered a lot over the story of the rich young man from the Christian scriptures. Most of you, I'm going to guess, are familiar with the story, but so the rich fella comes up to Jesus and says, Lord, what do I have to do to follow you, to be with you, to be a part of your community? And Jesus says, well, you have to follow the commandments. And the rich guy says, well, I've done that. Now, between the lines, Jesus is kind of skeptical, because how could he still be rich when there were so many poor folks if he was loving his neighbor as himself, which is pretty much up there in terms of commandments, right? To love the Lord our God with all our hearts, all our minds, and all our souls, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I'm going to guess the rich man didn't go to bed hungry at night. And I'm going to guess that he had, enough clothing to dress appropriately for the conditions. I'm going to guess he had a home. And I guess that his children did too. I'm going to guess that the poor folks that maybe he didn't know, but were members of his community, weren't loved in quite that way. And so thinking about this story, Jesus tells him that what he needs to do is sell everything that he has and give it to the poor, and then he can come and follow him. And the rich man, we know, doesn't do that. He goes away sad. And that story, in a sense, summarizes for me what we ought to be about in terms of seeking shalom, in terms of seeking right relationships. This man was looking for a right relationship with the divine presence. He was seeking a right relationship with God. And what Jesus told him is, if you want that right relationship with God, if you want to be a part of my community, a community we know from the Acts of the Apostles where there weren't any poor folks because they shared everything they had with each other. So all their needs were met. They were a happy community. If he wanted to be a part of that community, if he wanted to have a right relationship with his God, then he needed to have a right relationship with the poor, his poor neighbors. It was not possible for him to have that right relationship with his poor neighbors unless he decided to have a right relationship with the wealth that was in his possession. And that right relationship with wealth is one that doesn't confuse possession for ownership. He confused his possession of great amounts of wealth with ownership. He doesn't own it. None of us own the wealth of this world. It was given to all of us to hold in trust for each other, especially the most vulnerable. We possess it on behalf of each other, especially the most vulnerable. We don't own it. Right? We didn't create it. Perhaps we earned some of it legitimately, but perhaps much of it was given to us, inherited by us, taken by us, more than we need. Thinking of the fellow up in Massachusetts, I don't know if you folks saw this, the executive for Liberty Mutual that recently resigned. For the last 5 years of recession, this man was taking home $25,000 an hour. Nice work if you can get it. Right? I don't think he had a right relationship with wealth. He was definitely confusing possession with ownership. If we're going to seek that right relationship with wealth, then we're going to see to it that it's meant, its purpose. The wealth of this world, the purpose of the wealth of this world is so that we can all have dignified lives where all of our basic human needs and human rights are met. And insofar as some of us have more than we need, others will be left in need. And so the call to love our neighbor as ourselves is not a call to enter into some sort of romantic relationship. Jesus wasn't talking about eros. It wasn't a call to perhaps be friends with everybody. He wasn't commanding us to philios. It was a call to agape. To love your neighbor as yourself is to see that your neighbor is fed as well as you and your children are. Now, the part of this that is informed by my experience living in the north end of Hartford is that a right relationship with others, particularly oppressed or impoverished others, that right relationship is not a long-distance, anonymous, charitable relationship. Right? That's not peace will not come from charity. Right? The old cliche from that came out of Vatican II is that peace is the result of justice. Well, justice comes about through a relationship, a meaningful relationship, a back and forth relationship, a relationship that has the depth of time, that has equal vulnerability. A relationship defined by charity is inherently unequal, and perhaps the most profound spiritual lesson I've learned wasn't one that they taught me down at Yale, and the Jesuits up at Holy Cross didn't teach me this. The little kids in my neighborhood taught me this. With each charitable act, the recipient is typically humiliated in some measure. And those of us that are in the position of doing the charity are typically blind to that. Not because we're bad people, but we're typically not folks that have been through that experience of having to beg for a God-given human right. And it's a humiliating experience to have to beg for food for your child. And it's magnified when the begging is anonymous. And I think the greater the pride experienced on the part of the person doing the giving, the greater the humiliation of the person doing the receiving. And so perhaps a more just relationship, a right relationship, would involve people that are in the position of privilege and power, that have the capacity to do greater charity, to get up and move, physically move themselves to oppressed and impoverished neighborhoods, and seek to share in the lives, building community, building that beloved community that the apostles had, sharing what they had with each other so that nobody was left in need. I think of this as sort of a liberation theology for the wealthy. Right? If wealthy folks seek to be saved, then I think they need to engage in the process of liberation. Liberation and salvation being two sides of the same coin. And that entering into impoverished and oppressed neighborhoods, not seeking to gentrify, not seeking to save in some sort of paternalistic way, but seeking just to be in community, to hear from oppressed persons their struggles in their words, not judging them, not trying to see their struggles from our shoes, from our perspective, but from their shoes and their perspective, I think is the prerequisite first step at trying to build a more peaceful world. It's one of the reasons I've traveled to the different places I've been to. My government has defined the people of Iraq as my enemy, but in my time there, I was never treated like an enemy. In fact, I was treated with incredible generosity. I was there one time in the city of Najaf back in 2000, and the U.S. had just dropped 2 cluster bombs on this city. Killed a dozen or more civilians, seriously wounded a dozen or more civilians. One of the wounded was this little boy, 6-year-old boy, whose his arm was blown off at the shoulder by the shrapnel. I have the shrapnel at home. And that boy wasn't my enemy, right? He was another father's son. And when I apologized to his mother for my part in that, right? We're a nation where the government's of the people, by the people, for the people, we the people, right? This was done in my name with my tax dollars. She was remarkably generous and said to me, you don't need to apologize. I don't hold you responsible for the actions of your government. Pretty remarkable, considering, my government held her child responsible for the actions of his government. Never mind that it was a dictatorship, he was a child. Right? But to be in that hospital and to try to see the world from her eyes, in his eyes, to try and walk the path with folks that are on the receiving end of injustice, I think informs us in a profound way, in a way that goes beyond the intellect, that touches at our hearts and our souls. Right? I'll close with this idea. So one of the ways that we pray we pray by fasting, right? Now, if I were to ask you all what it means to be hungry, you're all bright people, and you're going to give me a good definition of what it means to be hungry. If I ask you to go and fast for a week, and then when we reconnoiter, ask you to tell me what it means to be hungry, you're giving me a much more profound definition of hunger, because you will have experienced hunger. And in my mind, that connects you in some symbolic way. No matter how small, it connects you in some way with people who are hungering and have no choice in the matter. It's a different experience than the book knowledge of hunger. And it's like that living in the north end of Hartford. A whole lot of people in this state point fingers at my neighbors in my neighborhood and cast judgments on the beautiful people of my neighborhood, and they've never even been to my neighborhood, right? They say they're terrified of my neighborhood and the people in my neighborhood. My neighborhood is filled with beautiful people who have been abandoned by the middle class. They've been abandoned by people with white skin. And the first step towards right relationships, the first step towards peace in Hartford is for some of those folks to come back to the North End where there's plenty of buildings waiting for a loving family to move into it. Not to gentrify and to displace anybody, but to become neighbors, to become part of a beloved community with the wonderful people in my neighborhood, and hear their stories and learn from their experiences. Don't come trying to save them. The only person you might save is yourself, but come to be part of a mutual process of liberation. Because when we're liberated, we will have peace. And I guess that's it. All right.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace, God's peace be with you all. Peace in Islam does not simply mean the absence of war. It also means the absence of oppression, corruption, injustice, and tyranny. Islam considers that real peace can only be attained when justice prevails. The Arabic word Islam is derived from the same root as the word salam, peace, and has the same connotation as the Hebrew word shalom. And the best definition of the word Islam is really to establish or promote inner and outer peace in harmony with the will of God. The primary duty of a Muslim is to establish peace so that justice prevails and humanity prospers. A true Muslim does not commit acts of violence, either for the spread of Islam or for the purpose of achieving power in the name of Islam. Now, in the history of the world, there seems to have always been wars. I looked at, I was Googling war over the past month, knowing that I was going to be here today. And there was a very interesting site that I saw, and it said the facts on war and peace. And they basically reported that in recorded history, since 3600 BC, over 14,500 major wars have killed close to 4 billion people. That's 2/3 of the current world population. Fighting or war is only sanctioned in order to uphold justice and protect the rights of the weak and oppressed when they are desperately seeking protection, and when, I have to stress this, there are no other means to deter oppression. In the Quran, there is no concept of a war of aggression and no permissiveness towards violence. Where permission for war has been given in the Quran, it has been given to defend and protect the rights of the oppressed and exploited. And there is no verse in the Quran which permits violence for conquering territory or for achieving personal or communal power. Furthermore, permitted wars in the Quran have been qualified by the words fi sabilillah, in the way of God. God's way is one of protecting the rights of the poor and the exploited. The very first verse in the Quran that references permission to use violence illustrates this point. And what reason have you not to fight in the way of God and of the weak among the men and the women and the children who say, Our Lord, take us out of this town, whose people are oppressors, and grant us from you a friend, and grant us from you a helper. A Muslim cannot commit an act of aggression, killing the innocent, the sick, the elderly, monks, priests, or non-combatants is forbidden. It is completely forbidden in Islam. It is haram. Also, wanton destruction of land, forests, trees, and animals is specifically forbidden. The Quran clearly spells out God's distaste for destruction in verse 205, which says, But whenever he prevails, he goes out about the earth, spreading corruption and destroying man's filth and progeny, and God does not love corruption. It is therefore impossible to justify modern warfare, which cannot be waged without collateral damage to innocents, and which utilizes weaponry that cannot distinguish between willing fighters and everyone else. Needless to say, nuclear weaponry, unmitigated slaughter of all forms of life, the destruction of present and future means of sustenance, and the devastating effects on future generations are clearly incompatible with Islamic principles. Fight in the cause of God against those who fight you, but do not transgress limits. God does not love transgressors. An incredible and shocking fact is that in armed conflicts since 1945, 90% of casualties have been civilians, compared to 50% in the Second World War and 10% in the First World War. With these simple and jarring facts, I feel it's indeed incumbent on us, and for me as a Muslim, to promote and really impose the need for peace. Modern welfare is simply not allowed in Islam. Islamically, we need to redirect our focus and impose peacekeeping forces in any war-torn nation. We have a responsibility to the civilian population. We have a responsibility to remember and honor those civilians who lost their lives because they were simply just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The arms industry profits from conflicts all over the world, and it has not taken account for these profits. Weapon-making companies should not make a profit on war. Surely, if we do not allow countries to have nuclear weapons, we should also not allow countries to make money selling any weapons. That's actually a sentence taken from my daughter's essay, so I'm using that. We have enough nuclear weapons to destroy all of humankind. According to the Guardian newspaper, in 2009, Russia had 12,987 nuclear warheads. The United States had 5,552 nuclear warheads. France had 300, Israel had 200, United Kingdom had 192, China had 176, Pakistan had 90, India had 75, and North Korea had 2. All these countries mentioned should pay extra weapons taxes because really there's no need for nuclear weapons on Earth. There should be no need. My daughter had these great ideas after studying about the League of Nations and the United Nations, and she said, wouldn't it just make sense to strengthen the United Nations, an international law agency, so we can penalize war-making nations and those who already had weapons as well as weapon-making companies by fining them or making them pay an extra tax or charge? And I tend to agree with her. Wouldn't it make sense to take the veto power away from nations so they can get aid to the countries that need aid? For instance, like the Syrian dictatorship today, who weren't able to get help because of the veto power that the United Nations had. We need to reward peacemakers, is the bottom line. If we don't, human beings will be destroyed themselves. This mentioning of peacemakers reminded me of the Medina Charter, which was established by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Medina, soon after the early Muslim migration from Mecca to Medina. The charter was negotiated between the Muslims, led by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Jewish communities and the non-Muslim tribes, who already resided in Medina. The purpose of the pact was to maintain peace and security by protecting life and property of all inhabitants, and by guarding against injustice and aggression, regardless of tribal or religious affiliations. The Charter was notable in that it did not declare the state a state religion to be Islam. It protected freedoms for the whole community, regardless of religious or tribal identity. According to the Quran, relations among all human groups should be based on mutual acknowledgement and peaceful coexistence, regardless of any similarities or differences which might exist among them. The basic dignity of all people must be equally guarded, regardless of race, faith, nationality, or ideology. War is not an option whenever an inclination to peace is communicated. And modern warfare is certainly not an option if 90% of the casualties are innocent civilians. The Quran teaches us, if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or for spreading tyranny in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he had saved the whole of humanity. When one ponders the hardships and oppression that has resulted from world politics, one is left in despair. But as a Muslim, I have hope that this will change. Islamically, we have to start at the individual level. I basically have to start with myself. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Human beings are the family of God, and the most beloved of them to God are those who are the most excellent to God's family." He said, "Not one of you believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself." And this truly applies also to one's closest of kin. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The way you treat your spouse and your loved ones is a glimpse into your soul." If there is a light in the soul, there will be beauty in the person. If there is beauty in the person, there will be harmony in the home. And if there is harmony in the home, there will be order in the nation. If there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. Thank you very much.
Shalom Aleichem. Peace be upon you. It's nice to see you. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little tardy. I was training a student, thinking I would be at time if I came at 6:30, but I wasn't. But I'm here, and I'm delighted that you're here, and I thank all our hosts, Harvard Seminary, Hartford Public Library, and anybody else so gracious to have us here. To my fellow panelists, it's nice to see you, and thank you for the opportunity to learn with you, from you. I am here to reflect on what my tradition, what Judaism, as I see it, says about peace. And I thought in preparation, I would ask some of my students. In fact, that's where I was. I was working with a young woman who's becoming bat mitzvah, daughter of the commandment, this weekend on the Sabbath. And we were practicing for that wonderful occasion, that life passage, and she was reading the Birkat Shalom, which is the blessing of peace. And I thought I would read that to you. O God, may we never become complacent, faltering in our effort to build a world of peace. Let the nations know and understand that justice and right are better than dominion and conquest. May all come to see that it is not by might nor by power, but by your Spirit that life prevails. Much like you've already heard, Jewish commitment to peace is not just the cessation of war. It is the achievement of shalem, of wholeness. That until every child, and every man, and every woman goes to sleep at night, knowing that, God willing, he, she will wake up in peace, not just that there will not be war outside his or her window, but will wake up with wholeness and fullness and a sense that when he or she walks out into the world, that everybody there, not just the Jews around him, but the Christians, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, will understand that he is created in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim, and he or she will look into the eyes of those individuals and recognize the same blessing, the same beauty, the same power, looking into the eyes and seeing the spark of God. God that demands we bring peace to a world. Sort of the one gift we believe that is not essentially God-given, although it's blessed. Peace doesn't happen until we make peace. So another of my students suggested I read the following to you, which sort of gives you the backdrop by which we try to live our lives, not just in terms of peace, but in terms of all our values. It makes the peace even more important to us. When Torah, that's our sacred scripture, when Torah entered the world, freedom entered it. The whole Torah exists only to establish peace. Not just justice and compassion, but peace. Its highest teaching is love and kindness. What is hateful to you, do not do to any person. Sound familiar? Okay, good. Can all relate to the golden rule. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Those who study Torah are true guardians of civilization, honoring one another, doing acts of kindness, making peace. These are our highest duties. There's Shalom again. But the study of Torah is equal to them all because it leads to them all. Let us learn in order to teach. Let us learn in order to do. We have an interesting challenge to think somewhat self-reflectively and self-critically about what it's like to be Jewish in the pursuit of peace. So we just finished our festival of Passover. It's our festival of freedom. It is a festival that reminds us that our past is never truly far from the present. Well, so Passover reflects on the slavery my ancestors endured in Egypt, their sense of oppression. It's an oppression that is somewhat difficult in the comfort of our own lives. I'm assuming that we sit here in comfort, certainly relative to those who were enslaved, not only in the ancient world, my ancestors, but even today, there are slaves. We understand that that past is never too far from the present. So on one level, it motivates us to live for justice and compassion, two key virtues that underlie a peaceful society. It also leaves us vulnerable in the world, sometimes too vulnerable for our own good, in the sense that if we're afraid and untrusting of those around us, it will be difficult to achieve peace while we're protecting ourselves. Now, this comes to bear recently in our observance of Yom HaShoah. This is the day of memorial in which we think of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. 10 million human beings perished in the Holocaust. And so it's this legacy of oppression that again reminds me how important it is to be just and compassionate and loving and kind, and how basic unkindnesses can lead to a lack of peace. It also leaves us at times very sensitive, even too sensitive, to the world around us. I do not believe that Hitler hides in every corner, even after the Holocaust. I do not believe that. I have faith in human beings to recognize that I am created in God's image, just as they are. And they trust me to do so. It is when we don't trust each other that it's hard to forgive, and it's hard to forget, and it's hard to work together for peace. It's easy to allow our spiritual dramas, whatever they might be, however they might play out, to recognize that there are other people living out their own spiritual dramas, and that these dramas can be compatible if we recognize that we're working for a whole world. a world of peace. If we recognize that our spiritual dramas deny one another the space to operate in a world that demands wholeness and before a God that demands us to live for peace, then we'll struggle. We'll struggle politically, we'll struggle personally, we'll struggle in our negotiations. We may not even get to those negotiations because we don't trust each other enough. And that is sad. And of course, Yom HaShoah precedes another important holy day, one that we celebrate this week. Yom HaAtzmaut. This is a day of independence, the establishment of the State of Israel, which is a place near and dear to my heart. I was privileged to just be there and to recognize its challenges, together with its neighbors, to build a peaceful coexistence. Again, in this sort of self-critical way, when the Jewish state grows out of the ashes of the Holocaust, literally, that's what was the impetus. It wasn't just people trying to create space for one another. It was a terrible thing, the Holocaust. When we identify as Jews with Israel as really the phoenix from the ashes, and the Holocaust is always linked to the experience of living in Israel, we will fight hard for its integrity and its safety and its peaceful borders. And sometimes we might even fight too hard and create too many challenges for those around us because we're afraid, because we don't trust. And the extent to which that trust is not returned creates issues, serious, dangerous issues that get in the way of peace. So I'm glad to be here tonight to reflect on the importance of peace, the process of peace, how we get there, how we understand that as we live out our spiritual dramas, that we all deserve that wholeness one way or another, and we have to do our best to recognize the sacredness of those spiritual dramas, to recognize how important it is for each of us as individuals, not only as a people or as a faith tradition, but as individuals, to recognize that we possess inside of us the power to trust and the power to build a world that is more whole and full of shalom, of peace.
I would like to share some of my beliefs and some of the personal experiences behind these beliefs. I guess there are 5 or so things that are very much on my mind tonight. I'll begin with the obvious. We need to spend money on human needs rather than send tens of thousands of American troops to fight wrongful wars. We have spent over $1.4 trillion since 9/11 to fund the Iraq, Afghanistan, and other wars on terrorism. This averages out to about $10 billion per month. The cost breakdown is 94% for the Department of Defense, just 5% for foreign aid, and 1% for medical aid for veterans. The Bring Our War Dollars Home advocates have appropriately denounced the war costs. The social services safety net that serves our most needy citizens has steadily eroded as our war costs have ramped up. We obviously must put our own citizens first. However, we should also reallocate some of the war dollars to increase foreign aid. We could achieve so much by building villages rather than war machines. Second, we must not repeat our tragic follies in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but isolationism is not the answer either. We must take a forceful stand against genocide, and we must seek peaceful resolutions of armed conflicts throughout the world. Third, when we do take a stand, we must provide even-handed support for all victims of oppression. Israel and Palestine are an obvious example. I am pained by how long we waited to help the victims of the Holocaust. Craig, thank you for many of your poignant reminders of that. But I am also pained by how little we did to help the victims of the Nakba. Israeli and Palestinian lives are equally precious. Fourth, we must vigorously protect the civil liberties of all of our citizens. We cannot tolerate the scapegoating of the Muslim community. Tens of thousands of Americans were victimized by Joe McCarthy and his anti-communist paranoia. The 9/11 hysteria has led to the same victimization of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And fifth, we must take a more nuanced approach to U.S. government involvement as we do our peace work. We must find a middle road between blind patriotism and absolute cynicism. We must say no to the zealots who would go to war over every imagined threat, like Iran's supposed nuclear capabilities. But we must also say no to the other extreme. We cannot simply conclude that our government always does the wrong thing and proclaim the right of self-determination for the victims of oppression. So many are defenseless. Self-determination is a myth for protesters who have guns in their faces. We must accordingly encourage our government leaders to do the right thing. Diplomatic, economic development, and humanitarian aid do make a difference. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of my learning experiences, beginning with foreign aid. My strong feelings about foreign aid go way back to the 1950s and my Henry Snyder High School debate team experience. Henry Snyder is Jersey City, so I've got a bit of the Jersey City accent. There was a time when we did transformative things with foreign aid. That was back in the 40s and the 50s. Many of you know that the Marshall Plan literally helped to rebuild Western Europe after World War II. The United Nations has set a foreign aid giving target of 0.7% of gross domestic product for wealthy nations like the United States. The U.S. share has steadily dropped to 0.19%. Countries like Sweden and Luxembourg give up to 1%. Everybody talks about anti-American feelings abroad. Think about how different it would be if we met the UN foreign aid target. Think about what we could do with an additional $3 to $5 billion per month. Think of the number of new schools, new hospitals, and other public works. Genocide. I wonder so many times about what lessons we have learned from the Holocaust. People would talk about never again, but it never stops. Why have we done so little to stop these genocides of the last 50 years? The list is so long. I did some Googling on this. Go to Cambodia, 1975 to 1979. The Pol Pot regime killed 1.7 to 2.5 million of 8 million Cambodians, 20 to 30% of the population. Bosnia, 1992 to 1995, ethnic cleansing killed 150 to 250,000. Rwanda, 1994 Hutu militias killed between 800,000 and 1 million Tutsis in just 100 days. Kosovo, 1998, 1999, ethnic cleansing killed 20 to 30,000. Darfur, Chris, I'm glad you were there, saw some, as many as 300,000 have died. Couldn't we have stopped the devil on horseback? I don't get it. I really cannot accept the excuses for our too little, too late responses to these genocides. I understand, for example, that the Cambodian tragedy followed our folly in Vietnam. We did not want to repeat that mistake, but we still had a responsibility to do something. This is where moral suasion and non-stop 24/7 diplomacy and coordination with other nations come into play. Bill Clinton himself acknowledged some years ago that he should have done a lot more when he was president to stop the Rwanda tragedy. Rwanda was the right place for a concerted United Nations response. Perhaps we would have responded more forcefully if the genocide victims were white Christians. I don't know. In any event, we need to re-examine our priorities. Our national leaders seem to spend more time debating tax cuts for the rich than debating the best way to help victims of oppression throughout the world. I am thankful that the UN will be sending 300 ceasefire observers to Syria. This is at least the start. Israel and Palestine. It has taken me a very long time to be able to say that I am pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. I wish that more people would do that kind of thing. I am grateful to Israel for providing a homeland for my son-in-law Yoel's parents after World War II. They had no other place to go. Yoel's father survived the war by being hidden by Hungarian partisans. But a place for Yoel's parents to live must not come at the expense of the Palestinians. I literally knew nothing about the Nakba until just a few years ago. That was a totally new term to me. Nobody had told me about the mass deportation of 1 million Palestinians from their cities and villages, the massacres of civilians, and the razing to the ground of hundreds of Palestinian villages. I accordingly flinch when our congressmen automatically take sides in the ongoing tensions involving Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. We all know that Hamas's rocket and mortar attacks must be stopped. They are wrong, but Israel's disproportionate force against the citizens of Gaza must be stopped as well. And lastly, the civil liberties. Overturning the National Defense Authorization Act is a top priority of the anti-war movement. Every American must be entitled to due process of law. We cannot accept the targeting of the Muslim community. FBI surveillance of our mosques must be halted. West Hartford citizens who are